While the United States today is seen as the single most influential nation in international affairs, this was not always the case. It took hundreds of years of history for the US to achieve the status it has today. It had to go through long periods of growth and isolation before it began to play a major role in global affairs. In the beginning, before the US was even founded as a nation, millions of Native Americans already inhabited the land. Starting with Leif Erikson, but more famously Christopher Columbus in 1492, Europeans began exploring the New World. The discovery of the New World led to the Columbian Exchange, or the spread of crops, products, ideas, and diseases across the Atlantic. One of the most important examples of this was smallpox, which killed millions of Native Americans, making conquest much easier for Europe. Young Frenchmen were eager to participate in the fur trade. The English wanted to establish permanent colonies, and the Spanish wanted to extract silver and gold from the land. In order to gain riches in areas without gold, the Spanish forced natives to grow cash crops for them using the encomienda system. This period begins with the founding of Virginia by an English joint stock company in 1607. 12 more colonies were eventually created for things like profit or religious freedom. People began coming to America as indentured servants until Bacon's Rebellion showed the wealthy that this labor force was too much of a hassle. In 1619, 20 African American slaves were sold to Virginia for the first time. This led to the triangle trade between Europe, America, and Africa. Because the policy of mercantilism was designed to bring all the wealth to England, the colonies were limited in who they could trade with and mainly sold resources for English goods and slaves. In the French and Indian War, the colonists and the British fought together to defeat these threats. In order to pay debts from the war, England passed many taxes on the colonists who revolted in response. Eventually, the colonists declared their independence and aligned themselves with France to fight off England. After the Revolutionary War, the US gained recognition as a nation from the world. In President Washington's farewell address, he warned the nation not to form permanent alliances. The US entered a quasi-war with France since they had plundered American ships. This led to the creation of the Navy, and anti-French sentiment led to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made immigration to America much harder. After a revolt in Haiti, the US purchased Louisiana from Napoleon. As fighting continued between European powers, the US declared neutrality. The Embargo Act of 1807 prevented trading with England or France. Eventually, the US sided with France in the War of 1812 because England kept impressing US ships. At the end of the war, the Treaty of Ghent restored previous borders and established good relations with England. The Monroe Doctrine declared that the Americas were closed to colonization and Europe should not interfere there. This led to a large period of isolation in American history. Manifest Destiny is the idea that America had the holy right to expand to the Pacific coast. This led to the annexation of Texas and the Mexican-American War. After defeating Mexico, the US bought the Mexican cession in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Additionally, the US purchased Alaska from Russia, and Alexander Graham Bell's telephone increased global communications. During much of Reconstruction and afterwards, the US was not concerned with foreign affairs. Anti-Chinese sentiment grew so high in California that the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed to reduce Asian immigrants. Also, after 1880, most immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe. There was a native backlash against their new languages and ideas. In this time period, America developed many imperialist tendencies. The US began taking over many Pacific islands and entered a war with Spain. After the Spanish-American War, the US gained Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. President Theodore Roosevelt created the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, saying the US should be international police in the Western Hemisphere. Every imperial country wanted their share of trade with China, so the US proposed the Open Door policy, where China would be kept open for all powers. World War I began, and President Wilson declared neutrality. The US sold products to both sides, but more to the UK and France, and this angered Germany. Eventually, the US entered the war due to the sinking of the Lusitania. which had American passengers on board, and the Zimmerman telegram, which asked Mexico to go to war with America. Since the US wasn't destroyed in the war, it became a world power, but it preferred to stay isolationist, even though Wilson had proposed a League of Nations to keep world peace. When World War II broke out, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared neutrality, but the US joined the war after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941. After the war, the United Nations was developed to keep world peace. After the war, the US and the USSR were the two most powerful nations left. The US couldn't carry on its isolationism. In this period, called the Cold War, these two nations had a tense rivalry to dominate the globe. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as well as other similar alliances, formed against the USSR. The Cold War did heat up in Korea, where we aided South Koreans fighting off communist North Koreans. The USSR installed missiles in Cuba, but after negotiations they were removed. That was the closest the world ever came to a nuclear war. In Vietnam, the US aided the South Vietnamese, but eventually the war was too costly and the USSR collapsed, thus ending the Cold War. For a while, the US wasn't sure what its foreign policy goals should be. The US attacked Iraq to stop it from taking over Kuwait, and then again to remove Saddam Hussein. After the September 11th attacks, the US foreign policy began to focus on counterterrorism.